Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture Guide 2 where we pick up where we left off. We're in France. Last week we were looking at the classical tradition in France and the work that was produced by artists associated with the French Royal Academy. We looked at also art that was in England and an artist who was born in the United States but worked out of England as well, Benjamin West. And we're going to pick that story up again going back to France here and talk about how another style started to insinuate itself and challenge the classical tradition within the French Royal Academy by looking at the art primarily of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. It looks like Ingres, but it's pronounced Ang. So let's just talk a little bit about that classical tradition by looking at some of Ingres' first works and revitalizing or kind of reactivating some of the things we said last week. Now remember that in France at this time, which is the cultural center of art in Europe, all art that was being produced that was having effects on people and other artists was produced by artists who had been trained and were exhibiting in the French Royal Academy. Jacques-Louis David was our major exemplar last week, and the younger artist who basically picked up the mantle of the greatest artist in that classical tradition in France at the time is this man, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. So the style, remember, we can pick this up actually with the first work that I want to show you for this week. This is a work by Ingres. He was, as Jacques-Louis David was, a court painter for Napoleon Bonaparte. We can pick that style up here with this work. Remember what we're looking for in the classical tradition. We talked at length about the stylistics that are involved in classicism, the interest in idealism, works that were meant to appeal to the mind, rational, clear, ordered, and organized, and all of the things that contribute to that. That continues with Ingres, although he's a little bit of a transitional figure towards works of art that, and he's not a romantic, but towards works of art that started to be produced by other artists within the Royal Academy who were arguing for a new style to displace the classical tradition, what we call Romanticism. And some of you will be aware of this, and I won't always have time to make these types of connections, but the things that are going on in the visual arts are also happening in the other arts, music and architecture, literature, poetry, and so forth. So these artists aren't alone in these changes. In any case, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres starts off his career coming out of the French Royal Academy. Like David before him and many other artists, he wins the big prizes and is certainly the person that most people of the time would have thought was the next greatest artist after David was. Napoleon sure did, which is why he commissioned him to paint this work called Napoleon on the Imperial Throne in 1806, kind of at the height of his power in a way. Now, this work is very classical in the sense that it is balanced, it is ordered, it is about idealizing the subject, Napoleon Bonaparte, to make him look even more beautiful and powerful than he actually was. But there are also a whole host of things going on in this that are, let's say, less obvious, that still partake of the classical tradition. As we said with David, your number one job if you're a portrait painter for great leaders is to make them look good. And in this case, he does it in a number of really obvious ways and a number of fairly subtle ways. The obvious ways are, number one, he seats him in a throne, right? He dresses him in the finery of an emperor, but he also makes subtle allusions to the way that Napoleon wanted himself to be understood as coming from the imperial tradition that goes all the way back to Rome, as this art style, of course, in some ways goes all the way back to Rome. So for instance, On his head, he's wearing a laurel wreath or a laurel crown. That laurel crown was the crown that, of course, the Caesars in Roman times wore. So he's making a connection between himself and the traditions of Rome. This is Napoleon's left hand, you see kind of at a greater angle a staff on the top of which you see this kind of hand. That is to show that Napoleon has dominion over all things religious. This is the kind of blessing gesture that you oftentimes get from depictions of Jesus Christ, for instance. In Napoleon's right hand, raised higher over his head, he is holding a staff that shows he has dominion over the world, the mundane world as well. And this is a kind of symbolism that goes back to those ancient fasces that we saw in the depiction, for instance, of George Washington in that bundle. But beyond that, in the foreground, you might just be able to make this out and follow my cursor if you can't see it. There's an eagle on the carpet. That is a symbol of Rome. So it's as if Napoleon's saying, the France of the present taking over Western Europe is the next greatest empire after Rome. And then finally, something that's not so obvious unless you know the traditions of classical painting, which is the way that Napoleon is posed here, facing us fully frontal, facing directly out at us and staring directly out at us, is a type of depiction that was only used primarily for the representation of gods. You didn't show leaders doing this even. In other words, if you were to see a great leader, sometimes they're on a horse, sometimes they're kind of looking off into space, but they very rarely are this frontal and staring right back at you, because it was understood that that's the type of commanding, authoritarian pose that you only use for the depiction of God or Jesus or some kind of great God. So you can probably get this. What Napoleon's saying is, in using this conventional pose that's usually reserved for the gods, he's saying, I am the closest thing you can find to a god on earth. Now, one way to make this even more evident is to compare this work, Napoleon on the Imperial Throne, with another work that was created by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, known as Jupiter and Thetis, which you now see on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll notice that the pose is almost identical to Jupiter, who is the Roman name for the Greek god Zeus, and is, of course, the king of all the Greek and Roman gods. Now we have a standard depiction of a god in the way he's supposed to be depicted, fully frontal, gazing right back out at us, commanding, and, Ang used this for the depiction of Napoleon for the same reason, to make him seem kind of godlike. Now, always in the classical tradition, going back to Greek times, certainly through Roman times, into the Renaissance, and now in the neoclassical period, Greek and Roman mythology was considered to be a grand subject, one of those high prized subjects, something that could teach you something about morality or the reasons that humans are on Earth, or why things happen the way that they do. That grand subject that Nicolas Poussin said all great art has to start with. This subject is something that some of you may know about and many not. It has to do with an event during the Trojan War, in which the Greeks are at war with the Trojans because Paris, who is the son of the Trojan king at the time, basically through some various manipulations that we'll hear about at some point this quarter, was able to seduce and steal the great Helen, the most beautiful woman of the world, away from her husband in Greece and take her back to Troy, which starts this great battle. This is the story, of course, of the Iliad told by Homer. It's the story that is kind of the basis of a lot of Greek mythology. Now, in that story, at a particular moment in time, the great Greek warrior Achilles decides he's no longer going to fight on the behalf of the Greeks. You don't need to know the ins and outs of this, but he feels slighted. A woman, a concubine who he believes should be his, is taken by someone else, and he basically says this isn't fair, and he sits out a number of battles, sulking away in his tent. And when he does this, because he's the greatest warrior of Greek times, the Trojans start to win battle after battle after battle. Now, Thetis, the woman in this picture, is Achilles' mother. And if you know Greek mythology, when Achilles is born, his mother, who is a lesser goddess, takes him to a famous river, the river Styx, and dips him in the river Styx in order to make him impervious to any weapons of mankind. Because she is holding him by the ankle when she dips the infant Achilles in this river, the only area on Achilles' body that is not protected is his heel, his ankle, which today, of course, we call the Achilles tendon or the Achilles heel. And so eventually in this story, he will be killed by being shot in the heel by a poisoned arrow, but that hasn't happened yet. What's occurring here is that Thetis, his mom, is going to Zeus, the ruler in Olympus of all the Greek gods, and trying to talk him into getting Achilles to re-enter the war. Now, in this picture, you see off to our right-hand side an eagle. That eagle is a symbol of Zeus. There may also be some symbolism back with the last picture we've seen. We see this little face off to the left-hand side up here in this corner. That's Hera, that's Zeus's wife, who's on the lookout for any women who might be trying to seduce Zeus, since he's very well known for being easily seduced or seducing others. And he's sitting in his throne on the clouds up in heaven with this staff underneath his arm, showing his power to rule over all things. Now look at his body. The male body, as we said last week, when it's been idealized, is meant to symbolize the idea of the perfect man who is a personification of truth and beauty and goodness all at once. All these great things go along with that idealized male body. We see a different depiction of the female body. She's not as strong. She's clearly not as muscular, not that she should be as a typical feminine kind of figure of her time. But she's also really limp. She doesn't have, it almost looks like she has no bones in her body at all. And everything about the way that she is depicted shows her to be using what was considered to be the primary power of women, kind of typically from ancient times up until sometimes even the present, which is the power of seduction, the power of her looks, the power of the allure of the potential of sex in this occasion. I mean, literally, she's draped over his lap, she's touching his thigh, and she's reaching up to give him a kind of little tickle on the chin or something like that. Now, I point this out because for this week you had a reading on the subject of the female nude by John Berger called Ways of Seeing. And as he points out, and we will continue to develop this over the course of this lecture, there are two different standard ways that men and women, particularly male nudes and female nudes, although they don't always have to be nude, are represented. The man is represented and esteemed for what he can do, his act. Women, however, are oftentimes represented and esteemed for their appearance. That's John Berger saying men act and women appear. And we see that as well here. I mean, whatever she's going to be able to get done here has to go through, is circuited through Zeus. She needs to talk the man of action into doing something. Her action is to seduce him through her appearance or her looks. So let's move on with the story of the female nude a little bit. You don't need to remember this work. It's a work not by Ang, but by someone else that is kind of a pseudo-documentation of one of the ways that Napoleon came to power. Before he claims himself emperor, he goes to Egypt in particular, but all of North Africa, and seeks to reconquer North Africa. What he's really doing in the late 1790s is trying to secure various trade routes for the French and keep them away from the British, who are the major rivals for French power at this time. Now, believe it or not, the campaigns, Napoleon's African campaigns, were a horrible failure. He takes Cairo and he takes Egypt only to lose it almost immediately to the British. But through the powers of propaganda, such as paintings like this, it makes him seem like he's done all these great things. The real importance of this part of the context, what's going on in the world at the time and how it has an effect on the art, is that this type of exploration of foreign countries and what in Europe they called the Orient, these areas from, and by the way, the Orient didn't just mean Asia, it meant anything from North Africa all the way to the Far East. These areas were seen as exotic and different and really interesting. And as the technology became greater and greater to represent these through what you're seeing here as a print, people got more and more interested in exotic, orientalized subjects. And nothing became more popular at this time than representations of exotic women of these foreign countries. Before we get to those women, though, just thinking about some of the things that become popular, think of it this way. Napoleon goes to North Africa, especially Egypt. He, by the way, brings with him a number of scholars, almost 200 scholars, to document and to study Egyptian pyramids and the Sphinx. And this is the time, by the way, that they found the so-called Rosetta Stone, which had hieroglyphics and Greek and another language on it, so that it allowed them eventually to decipher hieroglyphics. All these stories are coming back about these cultures, and it reactivates an interest in these cultures, particularly Egypt. And of course, the Sphinx would be represented numerous times in art of this time. So it didn't take much for a lot of the painters of the time to pick up these subjects and start to use them in their art. What we're looking at here actually goes all the way back to Greek times. It's the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx from Sophocles' great trilogy. And in this story, some of you will know about this story. Oedipus is he's a rather strange character, right? In the story, he will eventually go on to accidentally kill his father and marry his mother because he doesn't know who they are. He was abandoned at birth because his parents took him to an oracle, and that oracle told them, hey, you might want to watch out for this kid because he's going to kill you, Dad, and Mom, you don't even want to know what's going to happen here. So they abandoned him. In any case, he because he is a Greek hero, he does a number of really wonderful things, including saving the city of Thebes from this horrible Sphinx who is terrorizing the city. Now, the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx gets popular again at this time period because of the great Sphinx outside of the great pyramids of Giza that everyone's hearing about again, and all the Sphinxes that are all over, not literally, but sculptures of them all over Egypt. So he revitalizes this subject. If you don't know how this subject goes, the Sphinx, of course, has the head of a woman, the wings of an eagle, and the body of a lion, and sometimes she has a snake's tail, although not always. So she's what we call a chimera. And a chimera is just a name for a creature that is made up of different animal parts, such as she is. Well, in the story, the Sphinx is terrorizing the people of Thebes and challenging them to a battle of wits in which she asks them a riddle, and if they can answer the riddle, she loses, and she'll go away and leave them alone. If, however, they can't answer the riddle, she gets to kill them. And in the foreground here, you see some bones of some other people who have not, successfully answered her riddle. Now, the story itself goes this way. The riddle that the Sphinx asks is, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? I mean, that's the short version. And Oedipus, who is the exemplar of rational thought, right? He's smart enough to figure this out, is able to answer correctly that man is the answer. Man who crawls on all 4s in the morning of his life, walks on 2 legs in the afternoon or in his prime, and then at the end of his life needs to walk using a cane, thus using 3 legs in the evening. Remember that classical art is about the rational powers of man, the perfection of those rational powers, and that's what this story represents. That's what makes it, in a way, a classical subject. The reason that in this case Oedipus is nude is primarily so that we can show that perfect male body, which, if it is ideal, is godlike and rational and true and good all at once. Remember, we talked about that last week. So all of that is encapsulated in this picture, as well as this little nod to the exoticism of ancient Egypt by depicting a sphinx in here, which was on everyone's mind at the moment. Now we come to the tradition of the female nude in art, and what you're looking at here is a work that is known as the Grand Odalisque, or the Large Odalisque. It's a medium-sized painting, but it is a really grand subject, is what he wanted to say about this. If you don't know, the classical tradition of the female nude in some ways parallels that of the male nude. In Greek times, it's about 100 years after we have the depiction of male nudity just about everywhere that you start to see more and more sculptures of female nudes, although they weren't held in as high of esteem. Also, it doesn't happen in the Roman times. There are very few nude women during Roman times, and not all that many nude males either, frankly, during Roman times. But when we get to the Renaissance period, by the 1400s, the female nude becomes more and more popularized, particularly with the late 1400s work by Sandro Botticelli, for instance, or the early works of the 1500s or 16th century, Titian, for instance. Now, again, during Renaissance times, the most exalted subject was the male nude, things like Michelangelo's David, because remember this logic. If you are perfect, made out of those perfect rational proportions, you are in God's image. And by looking at these male nudes, you're coming the closest to God's perfection in the world that you could come. However, when it came to the female nude, that belief system, let's say, wasn't quite as firm. It rather becomes more of a kind of justification for the representation of female nudity. Or another way to put this is to say, when Botticelli at the end of the 1400s is representing Venus, for instance, famous works such as that, on the one hand, people would let it go because nudity, after all, if it's made beautiful and perfect, must be a manifestation of the divine. But it doesn't take very long before that female nude isn't just Venus. She's a figure lying in a bed giving you a come hither look, a little bit like this figure here. In the 19th century, the female nude gets even more popular because it's justified on the grounds that nudity, which started with the male tradition, also is about idealism and beauty with a capital B, and truth and goodness and godliness and so forth. But, you know, let's stop and think about this a little bit. The Napoleon, for instance, as the peace bringer that we saw last week, and this work share in common a nudity, but beyond that, there are some really fundamental differences that should make us pause and think about this tradition a little bit more. Number one, let's start with what an odalisque is. An odalisque is actually a harem slave. A harem is a kind of place owned by primarily Arab, although not exclusively Arab, rich sultans that host women that are concubines, who are basically sex slaves for the great leader. When these soldiers with Napoleon went to North Africa, they came across these areas, or at least they heard about them. They weren't actually open to anyone but the owner of these women, but they heard about these. And of course, it sparked a lot of male fantasies about these, you know, areas that held numerous women of great beauty who were just there to please their owner. So here's where I have to pause for a minute again and say, on the one hand, what we're looking at is a subject that comes out of the tradition of the female nude that's been around for quite a while. And on the other hand, we have an extension of that subject into a realm that it's never taken before. And that's the idea that this woman is not Venus, the goddess of beauty. She's not some kind of personification of a Greek goddess or something of that sort. she is supposed to be, first and foremost, a sex slave. And while male fantasy has always been a part, male heterosexual fantasy in particular, has always been a part of the Western tradition of art, it's almost never very blatant, right? You can't just say, hey, I'm painting this picture because it's a hot woman and I like hot women, who doesn't? So I'm going to paint it. Art was always seen as lofty. It was supposed to be important, as we read in Poussin. It's supposed to have some kind of larger moral message. So you can't just say, hey, this turns me on, I'm going to paint it. You have to have a lot of what I call cover stories or justifications for what you're painting. And in this case, the justification is that it is a nude. Now I'm going to pause here for a minute so I can get a drink of water. I'll be right back. You'll miss very little, but I'm going to go on to talk about, of course, the reading in relation to this work. So to recap that just a little bit, it's a complicated subject. The reason that Jean-Auguste Dominique is able to paint the female nude is that it comes from a long tradition. And just like the male nude, if you represent the perfect idealized female, beautiful female, you're representing something that's lofty, that is something that is, partakes of the realm of beauty with a capital B and puts it in proximity to the realm of God and truth and goodness and all these wonderful things. But he stretched that a bit by making his subject not a Venus, not a Greek goddess or something of that sort, which is the most common representation of the female nude, but rather a harem slave, someone who's literally a sex slave in her harem here, looking back out at us. So John Berger, in your reading, makes a distinction that he takes from a great, very famous art historian, Kenneth Clark, between what he calls the naked and the nude. The nude, and I'm not going to tell you everything about this because I want you to work your way through that reading and answer the questions that I've given you in the reading guide for this week's summary essay. But the nude, as John Berger puts it, is a form of dress, by which he means it's a convention. In other words, when you see a woman without her clothes on in art, it's not supposed to be something that necessarily appeals to your emotions or your sensual, erotic self. It's supposed to be something that appeals to your rational powers of your mind, that perfect set of perfect proportions that, God put into the world and so forth. And thus, when you look at a female nude, you'll say something like, oh, it's okay that she doesn't have her clothes on because this comes from this great artistic tradition. And the example that I usually give in face-to-face lectures is, if I take a picture of this and I hang it on the wall of the school, or any number of paintings, they'll be okay and people will leave them up, and every once in a while someone will get a little bit grumpy about a nude there, but they tend to say, well, it's art, so it's okay. That's what Berger means to say about the nude on the one hand. I'll keep fleshing this out. On the other hand, however, if I were to take a picture of just a nude woman, let's say it's a real person, I take a photograph of her and hang her on the wall, it's probably not going to stay on the wall very long before someone takes it down and says, listen, this is erotic or it's pornographic, and it shouldn't be up there. In other words, there's a convention that kind of protects the representation or the public exhibition of artworks, whereas other things are seen as, erotic. Now, Berger goes on to say, again, taking this from Kenneth Clark, that there's something that we might think of that also goes along with the nude, which is that it objectifies the female body. It turns her into an object of male desire. And what is meant by this argument is that some of those conventions that are used in the depiction of the female nude, in order to protect it, in order to say this is art, also turn the female into an object of male desire. And by extension, not only does this reflect societal views, and those societal views are that the thing that woman is most highly esteemed for is her physical beauty. How beautiful she is the thing that society wants most from her. And women internalize this and start trying to fashion themselves to be like those things that they see in the realm of representation, whether it be paintings here today or all those fashion magazines that you can see out there, in our world of the contemporary moment, in which young women and women at large look at those, and of course you want to be like those figures, be like them. And so it perpetuates this idea that what men want from you, what men esteem from you, admire in you, is your beauty, and you should try to fashion yourself into the most beautiful thing that you can be, because that's the most important thing in the world. So what goes along with this, and why we use the term objectification, is that in depicting women in such poses, nude and compliant with the supposed heterosexual male viewer in front of these pictures, is that the woman there doesn't appear to have any personality or feelings of her own. There's never a moment in front of these pictures, or very rarely, in which you wonder, who is she? What is she thinking? Does she like me or not? She's just an object of your desire. Whatever desires you have for her, you get to project onto her, and she should fulfill those desires from you. Nakedness, in contradistinction to this, for Kenneth Clark and Berger, is these rare moments in front of a work of art in which you start to feel like there is a person there in the work who has their own feelings and their own desires, which very well might not match up with your own, and you have to take those into account, right? You have to treat her as a person with her own feelings rather than just thinking of her as an object of your desire. And we certainly don't get this here. I mean, she is posed for us. She is literally a harem slave. So as the viewer of this, the presumptive position that you take as the viewer is as her owner, right? She is literally an object of your desire. But a good example of the difference of this is, if you've ever seen a picture of someone without their clothes on, versus having accidentally walked in on someone in a state of undress, you'll know the difference between these. When you come in contact with someone without their clothes on, oftentimes, let's say it's by accident, the immediate response is kind of embarrassment, right? I'm sorry for walking in on you. I apologize. Now, why are you apologizing in that situation? Well, because you know that you've imposed yourself on them, that you are seeing them in a state of vulnerability, or a state that they don't necessarily want you to see them in. You're thinking about their own feelings. You're not treating them as an object, you're treating them as a person. And the term that Berger uses for this is the naked, which very rarely shows up in the realm of art. Now I want to complicate this a little bit by saying that in addition to what I've said so far, there is something that occurs that John Berger wants to point out in front of these works of art, where in particular there's a kind of power dynamic set up between the viewer and the painting itself. Now, the presumed viewer of these pictures was a heterosexual male, and in that situation the man is set up in what we call a voyeuristic position of power. We use the term voyeurism because what is being trying to be kind of said by that term is, imagine yourself looking through a peephole at something. It doesn't need to be a nude woman. It could be anything. But in this situation, let's say you're looking through a peephole and you get to see someone in a state of not wearing their clothes. You're the voyeur. You're in a position of mastery, of power. You get to see someone else who doesn't get to see you or know that you're there in return. And so, in a way, you're put into a position in which you hold all the power and they're just the object of all your fantasies. This type of what we call viewing dynamic is the most prevalent form of viewing dynamic set up between nude depictions of women and the presumed male viewer of these. Now, to complicate this a little bit more, let's say you're a heterosexual woman viewing this picture. What position do you take vis-a-vis this woman that you're looking at? And the argument is usually that what ends up happening to female viewers of this is that they basically imagine themselves in the position of this woman. they have a kind of viewing dynamic that's about what we call self-surveillance, which is a fancy way of saying that they identify with this figure and they internalize, or they seek to fulfill the types of allure that this woman has, both in their own head but also in the world at large. Or, to say this another way, all those fashion magazines that are out there that show very, very beautiful women on their covers and in their pages are, of course, sold to women. Now, why are women buying these instead of men buying these? And the answer is that women seek to have the same allure or power that they believe that woman in those fashion magazines has as well. And the rationale behind that is that society really admires a beautiful woman. And if you are beautiful, society will admire you too. So you seek to conform to that ideal of beauty that you see in fashion magazines, or before fashion magazines were around, the paintings that were in the world. Self-surveillance is a way of saying that, and we all do this all the time, we look at ourselves, or we imagine ourselves, who we are in the world, through societal's views of what is seen as important. If you've ever felt really self-conscious, really kind of aware of everything you're doing and how other people are seeing you, that's just an extreme version of something that happens all the time, every day, self-surveillance. It's a complicated way of saying, though, that what happens to us in the world is that we understand, either overtly or implicitly, what the world wants from us, what the world esteems from us. And that oftentimes takes a very gendered dichotomy. Men have certain things that they're esteemed for, their acts, and women have certain things that they're esteemed for, their looks or appearance, and we seek to conform with those societal views of us, so that these works then set up a situation in which women see themselves in relation to these depictions of women of beauty, in this case a woman who's submissive and is there for a man, and think in their heads, maybe not consciously but subconsciously, oh, if I want to be more liked or more esteemed or more valued in the world, I should be like that. And that's one of the big hearts of the argument that is at work in Berger's argument, because as he goes on to point out, the tradition of the female nude then not only perpetuates the societal view that women should be objects of male desire, but also perpetuates and extends those views onto real women who seek to conform to the idea of beauty, of being more alluring, as if that is some kind of real power in the world. And I'll have you think about that a little bit. You can be the most beautiful woman in the world. What power does that get you? You know, how much effort do you put into that, and what kind of agency or power does it allow you to exert on the world around you versus, think of men, a man who is esteemed for all the things that he's accomplished in the world, what he's able to do and achieve. Of course, that's a different kind of power. Now, there's a lot more to that argument, but let's stick with that for now and talk about some of the specifics of this painting. As I said, the subject is she's a harem slave. You are presumptively her lover. It sets up a powerful position for you, the viewer, and her, an objectified position. After all, it doesn't matter who you are, how unattractive you are, how little you've achieved in the world, you literally own her as the viewer here. And that look that she's giving you, ready in this case for an erotic encounter, kind of come hither look or accepting look, will be the same look she gives every single person who stands in front of this picture. It's never going to confront you or make you as the male viewer feel self-surveillant yourself, like, oh, I'm not good enough for her. And that's one of the power dynamics going on here. She's wearing very exotic stuff, right? Things that are associated with the so-called Orient, that head wrapping and some jewelry on her arms and silks and satins and furs, a lot of things that are very kind of touchy-feely. In her hand, she holds what's kind of a fan, made out of feathers here. Very beautiful. Off to the right-hand side over here, you see an incense burner. And right next to it, to make her even more compliant and more ready for whatever fantasies you have for her, is an opium pipe, which, opium and opiates at this stage are associated with the Orient. People are playing around with these new narcotics, but they're also seen as things that are aphrodisiacs and kind of starting points for sex. So it's setting up a very kind of erotic encounter here that is justified once again by the fact that she's a female nude, and this is a great painting. Other things to point out about this, though, that got it criticized and showed Ingres moving away from the classical tradition are her bodily proportions. If you look at her back, one of the big criticisms of the time is this elongated C curve of the back doesn't make any sense realistically. If that's what her back looks like, she's going to have to be seeing a chiropractor on a daily basis. She has, as one critic put it, at least 3 too many vertebrae. Now, why did Ingres do that? Well, he knew how to make a rational, perfect set of proportions for figures, but he's trying to exaggerate the sensual curve of her back and really give you a lot of back to look at. He has very carefully orchestrated this entire picture as well by setting up a series of, repetitions, the repetition of this triangle of the arm and the negative space of the hole between her arm and her body here, with the same kind of triangle over here with a peekaboo of a breast in between that, and then another triangle over here of the knee, and you could keep doing this all the way through, right? So the other thing to say about this, though, that justified this work, the reason that the French public didn't go crazy and say, wait a minute, art's gone one step too far, now we're depicting harem slaves as supposedly, justifiable subjects in art, is that it came with a kind of implicit moral message, which goes like this. It's a part of your optional reading this week by Linda Nochlin on the question of the female nude, which is that the French public would have immediately recognized that this is supposed to be set somewhere else in one of those, Oriental countries, which the French really believed and most Western Europe believed were, at a lower stage in the social or civilization kind of evolutionary order. They're behind us all. They treat their women very poorly. They keep them as sex slaves, and we don't do that to our women in France. So it started off with a kind of moral superiority message. Look at how those, in this case, North Africans treat their women as objects of desire. Isn't that bad? We are better than that in France. But I'll point something out, right? Does she look North African to you? Does she look Asian to you? She looks like a typical French women, or certainly Western European women. She's set up as a male fantasy for these Europeans who can justify looking at her and objectifying her themselves by saying, aren't we culturally superior to those people in the Orient? And he does this over and over in his art because this subject sells. People are buying this like crazy, and the French Royal Academy accepts it as a genre in its own right. The female nude becomes its own subject in the realm of the Royal Academy of the Arts. So I show you here one of the most kind of overt examples of everything I just told you before. This is a work by Ingres called The Turkish Bath. And yes, this is the shape of the picture. It is literally in the circular shape to set you up as a voyeur of the scene, as if you're looking through a keyhole into a harem and seeing all these beautiful women just awaiting you so as to fulfill whatever sexual pleasure you might have in mind from them. Now, when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, but I presume there's still some of this out there, I don't know the number of movies that would have this male fantasy in which the high school boys would look through a hole in their locker room wall into the women's locker room. And it was always this exotic fantasy that we'd look through this keyhole, and what you'd see on the other side are these beautiful women getting out of the shower with their hairs wet in their towels, prancing around and, slapping each other with towels and braiding each other's hair and all these things that I'm just going to presume don't happen in women's locker rooms ever. But they're part of that male fantasy. And here we have something very similar, right? You look through the keyhole, and what you see, and this wouldn't have been what a harem looked like, we presume, are all these women lying around completely nude, or, posing, or let's just kind of go through this, playing music in the foreground, or posing over here, or cuddling and kind of fondling each other over here, or braiding each other's hair, or dancing. This is just a total male fantasy, right? So the female nude, this is the key. It has a ton of basically cover stories or justifications. It comes from the tradition of the male nude. It's about truth, beauty, and goodness and all these wonderful lofty things. Or it comes from the realm of cultural superiority. We French don't treat our women as objects like this. But in the end, what it does is it shows you the very thing that it's supposedly condemning or saying is questionable, right? The eroticized, objectified female body. It also intensifies the pleasure here to imagine yourself looking through a keyhole where you're not going to be seen in return, but you get to see everyone in this picture and gain that pleasure. That voyeuristic position is very powerful. And I'll just point this out as well. Voyeurism in general is something that basically eludes the dynamic of self-surveillance or feeling self-conscious. If you have ever, and I don't presume any of you have, peeked through someone's keyhole to look at them nude or, with them unaware, but if you've ever had the occasion to be looking through binoculars or a telescope and see someone who's really far away who can't see you in return, and you feel that momentary kind of power where you get to see them but they don't get to see you, that's what's going on here as well. It gives you that kind of pleasure, which is got a term. It's called scopophilia, although I'm not going to force you to remember that. So these are, in their own time, seen as just depictions of female beauty with a capital B. But, of course, in our age, where we're a little bit more critical and thinking a little bit more about the way women are oftentimes treated as objects of male desire, we can look back at these and say, wait a minute, they are also paintings that eroticize female bodies. They don't give us any sense of a woman who has her own personality or her own desires. It's not about, as Berger points out, female sexuality or women's desires. It's more about heterosexual male desires. It sets up a power dynamic that puts all the power in the hands of the male viewer, and on and on. So another of these, again, I'm barely scratching the surface. If we were in France at this time and we went to the Royal Academy of Arts, we would see thousands of nudes over the years on the walls. It's the most popular subject. And here we're looking at a work by Ingres called The Source. I could spend a ton of time on this as well. I'm going to keep it pretty short here. What we're looking at here is Ingres' way of esteeming one of the other things that women were really well esteemed for, which is being the vehicle through which life enters the world. The Source, the title of this work, actually refers to women as the bearers of children, those that give life to the world. And we see here a kind of young woman pose very beautifully against this wall, holding over her shoulder a vase through which she pours water out. Water, of course, being life-giving as well. Now, what I want to point out about this is, in this case, Ingres has depicted a rational, kind of very set up by a system of proportions female body. And, of course, he is esteeming the idea of women being childbearers, but he's gone out of his way not to represent the very thing that women bring life into the world with, which is their vaginas, their the female genitalia. You may not have noticed this already, and I'm always, and I've done this now, I've lectured for 30 years on art history, I'm always a little embarrassed to point out that the female nude, that tradition, doesn't have genitalia. It's not that they're shaving or they have depilatory creams. I mean, they just don't have any genitalia because, believe it or not, that was seen as too vulgar to represent female genitalia. There are a lot of penises out there because, after all, if you just erase the area of the penis, everyone would be freaking out. But here we don't depict it at all. And the reason I point that out is that rather than depict the actual genitalia through which life enters the world, he's used an allegorical symbol. That vase pouring out water is the closest thing he can get to a cleaned up version of how women bring life into the world. Actually goes back to a famous classical statement made by Aristotle, or attributed to Aristotle, which was that women were in the process of creation like a flower pot into which man planted his seed, and then they are kind of the incubator through which life comes into the world. Now, stop and think about this for a little bit. The classical tradition and, frankly, societal views will esteem women for two major things, being mothers and being beautiful. And in this case, we have beauty represented, but we don't really have the idea of childbirth here because it's seen as too vulgar, so we have to represent it through a symbol. And the symbol, stop and think about this, is really kind of like one of those backhanded compliments. Women are a flower pot into which men plant their seed. And by the way, Aristotle said that everything active is in that male seed, and women are a little bit like the passive recipient of that and an incubator until, of course, childbirth occurs. So even as he is esteeming women for bringing life into the world, this allegory about the source of all life, in a way, he's saying, well, they're just kind of the incubator through which life enters the world. What you're looking at here is another work by Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng, which is a portrait. Most of the artists that you'll see in this class also made a pretty good living out of painting portraits of important people. And I bring this one in, which is called the Comtesse d'Ossenville, in order to make a really kind of simple point. Art reflects societal views, right? Art reflects the belief systems, in this case, about gender in the 19th century in France. Men are esteemed for what they can do, their acts. Women are esteemed primarily for their looks. So the Comtesse d'Ossenville was a very important woman, a countess, had tons of money. She was actually an amateur woman of letters, as most rich people were. She wrote literature and poetry and so forth. But when she sits with Eng in order to paint her portrait, what seems to have been most important for her is to show how beautiful she is, right? She's a great beauty in fashionable dress. You can see her from the front, and behind her is a mirror that shows her from behind. And just to double down on the idea that she is alluring or very much admired by male suitors, we see some symbolism. On the table behind her, you see opera glasses here. And then right beside that, follow my cursor, are a bunch of calling cards. You see, in the 19th century, one of the places that women went out into the public to be seen and to solicit the attention of young male suitors was at the opera. Believe it or not, women couldn't just stroll down the streets by themselves. They couldn't even stroll down the streets with, other women. They always had to be accompanied by chaperones in public. So there are very few places that women could go out in the public realm and catch the attention of men. The opera was one of those places. Now, she's been to the opera. She's captured the attention of a number of probably prominent suitors, and they've come to her home and they've dropped off their calling cards for her. Pierre and Jacques and whoever have seen her. She's hot, and they're going to stop by and say, Jacques would like to come calling for you sometime in the future, or whatever it is. Now, she's got her hand on her chin here, which is typically the pose of someone who's in thought, right? Rodin, as we'll see later in the quarter, does this with his famous The Thinker, in deep contemplation about something. But in this case, she's not contemplating, right, like the mysteries of the meaning of life or deep philosophical ideas. What she's contemplating is which one of these men is the most viable guy to allow to come visit her. She's caught up then in the idea that what is most important for her, most important for the society around her, is to be beautiful, to capture the attention of men. That's the thing that she wants to push here. You would never, I think, see a man or a picture of a man here as his portrait, in the same way, thinking about which woman he should invite in. This is all very gendered. We saw it before with Sir Joshua Reynolds, for instance. So I want to move now on very quickly to one other artist of the classical tradition before moving on to Romanticism. Not because I mean, really, if this was a much longer class or I wanted to give you 5-hour lectures every week, we could spend a lot of time on the classical tradition, but in order to keep it brief, some of the works of art we're going to spend a lot of time on, and those are the ones you really have to know for your weekly reflective essays or for discussions or even for the quizzes coming up. Some of these works that we go over very quickly, just see these as further examples of things that we've already talked about, and the ideas that accompany them should be in your notes and should be applicable to other bigger works of art that we talk about, but you probably won't ever be asked questions on these lesser works of art or these artists that I'm just treating very briefly. I just want to give you more examples. And after all, it'd be definitely boring if I spent, a half hour on every single work of art telling you everything I could about that work of art rather than showing you lots of works of art, giving you little ideas in some of these, again, brief discussions of works of art that then you can use to apply to other bigger works of art. So in this case, you're looking at a new artist. His name is Jean-Léon Gérôme. Again, comes out of the classical tradition. He's, a very favored painter in the French Royal Academy. And here you see a work that's called The Death of Caesar. It again starts with a grand subject, this famous moment in which Julius Caesar, the first major emperor of Rome, is assassinated by his Senate because he's power hungry and they want to return Rome to a republic. So it starts with that grand subject, and now we go on to the other classical elements of this work of art. We see a very clear focal point, right? The artist has used the light to identify the senators who have all carried out the assassination and are now running off into the streets of Rome to proclaim Caesar is dead and long live the Republic. It is also set in a very classical setting. Just like Sir Benjamin West before him, Jean-Léon Gérôme has studied classical architecture, in this case, the theater at Pompeii. Remember, they've just started excavating Pompeii in the middle, about, almost 100 years before this. And he's gone there and studied that theater so that he can be archaeologically accurate and set the scene in Roman architecture. Off to one side is a symbol of justice. Off to the other side over here is one of the senators who's waiting behind and kind of contemplating the actions, right? Remember, classical works of art are meant to appeal to the mind, not the emotions or the senses. In this case, he's thinking, what does this all mean? Are we going to go the right way or the wrong way? And almost forgotten in the foreground, with very little blood shown, is Caesar, a kind of crumpled little body here. So all those classical elements, very much the most important types of works of art at this time. But of course, artists also want to play at this time to more dramatic subjects, which will lead eventually to a totally new style coming about, Romanticism. We're not there yet, but in this case we've got another work by Jean-Léon Gérôme called Thumbs Down. What we're seeing, again, comes out of classical times. It's a Roman gladiatorial event in one of the great amphitheaters. In this case, he studied the Colosseum in Rome. And, in those gladiatorial games, the gladiators would face off to each other and sometimes fight to the death. When one of the gladiators had fought a really strong battle but had lost, sometimes the other gladiator would look up into the crowd and say, has he fought well enough for me to spare him? Which would be a thumbs up, or should I kill him? Should I finish him off? Which is a thumbs down, which we're getting here. What I wanted to point out about this is while it comes from the classical tradition being a classical subject, and while the artist has studied, the correct kind of armor of a gladiator, his sword, his helmet, while he is certainly picking a classical subject and representing it in a very classical way, it's a little bit more dramatic than some of the classical subjects that come before it. Also by Jean-Léon Gérôme, again, just to point this out, a couple of quick examples. We have things that look a little bit like what you saw last week in Hiram Power's The Greek Slave. In this case, we have a work that's called The Roman Slave Market. We've got a woman standing on a platform being sold off into slavery, presumably for sex, I would believe. Her clothing has been stripped off her. She's ashamed, so she's putting her arm over her face, but just like the Greek slave before her, she's doing very little to cover herself up, and she's not really accurately, I think anyway, acting like someone who is being stripped nude and being sold off into slavery. And the reason for that is that, of course, this work is meant to give you the very pleasure that it is condemning, a pleasure of imagining or at least looking at this beautiful female body as an object of your desire. Or, closer in time, Jean-Léon Gérôme's work here called The Roman Slave Market. I'm sorry, not Roman Slave Market, just the slave market, where now we're somewhere in, one presumes, North Africa, and a young woman is being sold off into slavery for one of those harem scenes. And remember, on the one hand, the French would have said, isn't this horrible? I can't believe those people, treat their women this way. What he's doing is he's reaching into her mouth to make sure she's got all her teeth, but of course that's got some sexual innuendo to it as well. But on the other hand, they're painting scene after scene after scene of this so as to take pleasure in the very thing that they're condemning, imagining this kind of sexual scenario. Now, just very, very briefly, one part of your optional reading by Linda Nochlin is to point out something else that's a little bit, let's say hypocritical going on in the world at this time, which is that a lot of the models, artist models at this time were immigrants or people of the lower classes, and many, many times, we have lots of documentation of this, those women who had posed nude were taken advantage of by the artists sexually. This became such common knowledge that oftentimes artists would go out of their way to represent scenes that would show none of that's going on, at least in their studios, such as this work by Jean-Léon Gérôme that is known as The Artist and His Model. And what your optional reading points out is that everything is being done here to make this seem like there's no possible way anything erotic could ever happen between the artist and his model. For instance, making the artist himself much, much older, putting gloves on the model, making sure that the artist doesn't even look at the model, but only at his sculpture, right? Putting in the scene an example of what an artist's job is. He looks at the beautiful woman, but then he makes her even better. He cleans her up a little bit. He slenders up her thighs. He makes her breasts a little bigger. He elongates her neck. He pretties up her face some, because the artist's job is to create beauty, or the ideal. And in the background, you see a painting on the wall that is this painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme again, called Pygmalion and Galatea, taken out of Greek mythology. The story, very briefly put, is one in which a great sculptor sculpts the most beautiful representation of what he calls her Pygmalion, and he falls in love with her because he's so beautiful. And the Greek goddess Aphrodite, who is also known by the Roman name Venus, takes pity on him and makes her a living creature that he can actually, have a relationship with. However, in this story, or at least in the Roman versions of this story, in order to make sure that this is all about what we call platonic beauty, or platonic love and platonic beauty, meaning beauty that appeals to the mind and higher rational powers, Aphrodite only makes her live from the waist up so that nothing sexual can happen. And you see that here. She's turning fleshy colors on her upper body, but her lower body is still all marble, to make us all aware that the love that an artist has for beauty is something that is not sexual or not humanly erotic per se. So I'm going to pause here. And that will be the end of part one of this lecture, and we'll pick it up in part number two, where we go on to Romanticism and look at this famous work by Theodore Géricault and many other artists of this newly emerging style of the time.